Science and Civilization in China, Volume 7, Part 2, continuing with the introductory pages. Headed Vale Atque Ave. Coming to the end of Joseph Needham's Science and Civilization in China can only be compared, as an experience, to reaching the final page of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. One looks back at the journey taken, almost disbelieving its immensity. Parts of the landscape stand out clearly in the sunlight of memory, others are already covered over by the mists of uncertain recollection. One knows, however, that one could return there easily enough if the need arose. What is harder to recall is the different state of mind with which one started out long ago. One's conception of the world has been transformed, in the case of Gibbon, by a vision of the slow passage from antiquity to the Middle Ages, from our ancient Mediterranean imperium to the doubly divided inheritance of today, Eastern and Western Europe, and Christendom, or ex-Christendom, and Islam. In the case of Needham, by the revelation of a Chinese cultural universe whose triumphs in mathematics, the sciences and technology were often superior and only rarely inferior to those of Western Europe until about 1600. That contributed astonishing riches of practical invention to the origins of the modern age, the proper understanding of whose nature subverts the analytical logic of the standard model of modern Western history for those interested enough and historically modest enough to see why. The present volume, edited by Kenneth Robinson and partly co-authored by him and Huang Zhenyu, offers us a last chance to look a little deeper at how Needham thought about his work on the history of Chinese science in the wider context, both of Chinese society and culture, including the surprising capacity of the old Chinese literary language for technical precision when it needed it, and of comparisons between China and Europe. Some of this material is new, notably that on language. Some of it, for the cognoscenti at least, is old though not easily available, and revised and updated here in varying degrees. It has to be said that, as scholarship has advanced, not everything that Needham wrote 40 or more years ago on the social and economic history of China now seems as solidly based as the greater part of his reconstructions of Chinese technical practice and scientific theory. The reader needs to exercise a certain caution here, searching at times less for information than for inspiration. But the challenge of arguing with him is invariably well worth taking up, in these areas as elsewhere. He saw a number of pivotal problems before anybody else did, and struggled to discover answers with such psychological energy that even those we now tend to judge as partial failures are illuminating. In the scientific domain, of course, he grasped that the question of why something like modern science did not arise in imperial China was a serious one, even if it has since provoked efforts either to bypass it or to recast it in a fashion more amenable to testing. But even his famous theory that Chinese social structure in all of imperial times could be described as bureaucratic feudalism, on which I already differed with him in the early 1960s on the grounds that the changes over 2,000 years were too great to allow any single such label, if rigorously defined, to be applied equally to all periods, has a heuristic value. To put a complex point a little too simply, the phrase embodies a long-lasting characteristic tension in the cultured classes of Chinese society, that between a deep belief, universalistic at least within the Chinese occumene, in general ideals applied generally, and a comparably intense attachment to certain specific particularistic and personalistic loyalties. Perhaps, to use metaphorical language, one can say that some of the mountains that grew from his work have been more eroded with the passing of time than others, but the orogeny was extraordinary. Subheading: the Chinese perspective on the West. What is hard to come to terms with almost half a century after the appearance of the first volume in 1954 is the limited assimilation of Needham's work into the bloodstream of the history of science in general. That is, outside the half-occluded universe of Eastern specialists and a handful of experts sensitive to the decisive contributions of comparisons. Note: preeminently at the time of writing, Geoffrey Lloyd, see Lloyd 1996, Floris Cohen's Survey of Historiography of the Scientific Revolution, is also exceptional in devoting a long section to Needham's work, while his analysis depends on an unqualified distinction between science and technology that I, at least, find open to question. His appreciation of the key role of the Chinese case in helping to disentangle probable patterns of causation is exemplary as it is rare. See Cohen 1994. End of note. For these to be useful, there has to be enough in common between two domains to make comparison and contrast relevant, and enough different to make juxtapositions reveal critically distinctive aspects of one or the other. Though one should acknowledge the claims of Islam and India, it is China outstandingly that has the quality vis-à-vis Europe, and vice versa. It is ungracious to start what should be a celebration with negative comments, but this continuing neglect needs insisting upon. Opening an issue of Nature not so long ago, I found an essay by Adrian Johns that argues that the social structures of modern European science were invented to cope with an explosion of printed information. Note: Johns, 2001. Johns, The Nature of the Book, Johns 1998, is subtler. He rightly insists that it was not the technology of printing as such that was crucial, but the interactions of the potential of this technology with a variety of changing social and cultural circumstances, pages 19 to 20. But the absence of any understanding of, or even awareness of, the partial parallels and probable differences between Europe and the other and older great print culture, that of China, makes even this rich work seem one-dimensional. End of note. No one aware that printing was invented in China in or around the 9th century could possibly countenance such an argument, at least in such a simple form. Yet it seems that no one on the editorial staff of Nature knew or remembered enough to raise the question of the Chinese countercase with the author. Note: the underlying idea is derived from Eisenstein, 1980. End of note. One might say, with dry respect to Morris Lowe, that the only fault in his otherwise excellent recent special issue of Osiris, in its title Beyond Joseph Needham. Note: Osiris, 13, 1998. End of note. The majority of historians of science are still, usually willfully, on the wrong side, or at best, as in the case of my old friend Alistair Crombie, daunted by the immensity of the task of coming to serious terms with Needham's work, even though aware of its importance. Note: a comment based on years of participation in his seminar at Trinity College, Oxford, and several talks at his home in Boars Hill shortly before his death. End of note. Subheading: Addendum: the practical knowledge of probabilities. Liu Tun and Wang Yangcheng have recently published an anthology of pieces by both Chinese and non-Chinese scholars on the issue that concerned Needham. Note: Science and Scientific Revolutions in China, selected research on the Needham problem and related topics, from the Liaoning Education Press in Shenyang, 2002. End of note. Liu Tun cites and includes recent analyses that discuss the two main pre-Needham debates on the absence in Imperial China of a homegrown modern science. The first was that among the Jesuits and interested French scholars in the 18th century. The second was that started by Chinese intellectuals during the first third of the 20th century in the context of concern with China's modernization. This latter played a role in shaping Needham's own early ideas on the subject, and he knew most of the participants. Liu also gives references to, and some items from, the extensive discussions on the Needham problem that have re-emerged in China since about 1980. The collection further features many translations of recent Western scholarship, including pieces by distinguished historians of Chinese science such as Savin, Blue, and Hart, some sociology, and pages from contemporary mainstream Western historians of Western science such as John Schuster and Floris Cohen, plus Alexandre Poiré from an earlier generation. This book, which is a most valuable resource, appeared too late to be properly incorporated into the argument of this introductory survey. Overall, though, it tends, if anything, to reinforce one's impression that points of contact through which a live intellectual current is flowing between members of this mainstream and those inspired by the discoveries of Needham and his colleagues have remained, to date, disappointingly few. Crucially, intermittent inadequacy or even the collapse of the arguments of historians, the high quality of whose contributions one is generally happy to acknowledge, can often be linked with a disregard of the Chinese case. A simple example occurs in David Lindbergh's The Beginnings of Western Science. Note, Lindbergh, 1992, page 27, end of note. He sees the bursting creativity in lyric poetry and philosophy in ancient Ionia, the fountainhead of later European sensibilities, as being first and foremost the result of critical factor, namely the availability of fully alphabetic writing and its wide dissemination among the Greek population. Yet ancient China, beginning at much the same time, had superb lyric poetry and philosophers, some of whose work is still alive today, especially perhaps that of Chuang Tzu, and China used a non-alphabetic script. While this argument as stated is thus dead, there is still an important issue to be examined. Science, more than any other human pursuit, is situated at the interface between symbols and reality. The power or inadequacy of a symbolic system is not a trivial question. We all know how a new notation can transform our ability to grasp a difficult concept. Note: nowhere more spectacularly in medieval times than in the creation of a musical notation that permitted singers to sing directly from a score music that they had not previously heard. See Langelier 2000 on Guido d'Arezzo. End of note. What the comparison with China can help us do is to look for subtler characterizations than the crude and unhelpful alphabetic or non-alphabetic when exploring this interface. Numerals such as 1, 2, 3, etc. are not alphabetic. No one would, I think, essay the argument that this makes them inherently less useful than 1, 2, and 3, etc. It has been maintained, however, that the Chinese, equivalent 1, 2, 3, etc., were inferior to 1, 2, and 3, etc., which, given that they were similarly used in a decimal place value system, seems more than a little unconvincing. Note, in Huff, 1993, page 288. The European algebraic notation developed by Viet, a record, inventor of the equals sign, Stevin and others, is a different matter. Note, Crombie, 1994, page 519. Subtler and more interesting is the oversimplification committed by Edward Grant in the Foundations of Modern Science in the Middle Ages. Note, Grant, 1996. Grant uses the university as a magic variable that set medieval Western Europe apart from the rest of the world as regards the origins of modern science. This is not a trivial argument, but thus stated it is wrong. There were analogues to universities in China, though not many. Perhaps the best known example, though not the earliest, is the Tai Shui, or Great School run by the government during the Song dynasty. It had both mathematics and medicine in its curriculum, and examinations. Note: Wang Xin-chu, 1965. End of note. Both in the Southern Song and later dynasties, the academies, Shuyuan, also offered a mixture of instruction, debate, and training for the imperial examinations that changed over time. Note: Grimm, 1977. What Grant needs to do if his argument is to carry conviction is to sharpen up the focus and ask what it was about the Western university that was significantly different from these Chinese institutions as regards fostering the growth of scientific styles of thinking. My personal view is that this would not necessarily prove impossible to do. My point is that Grant does not see that it needs to be done. So we still cannot see clearly what it was precisely that might have made the difference. I have chosen the two foregoing authors because I have found their work in general interesting and valuable. My criticism is motivated by a friendly dismay, and not by a sense of hostility. Familiarity with the patterns of Chinese pre-modern science also helps disentangle the confusions that surround our conceptualization of the coalescence of scientific modernity. Most of us have enjoyed the opening sentence of the introduction to Stephen Shapin's recent little paperback. There was no such thing as the scientific revolution, and this is a book about it. Shapin, 1996. But such a delightful and insightful witticism is no substitute for analysis. If we use the analytical framework of Crombie's Styles of Scientific Thinking, Crombie, 1994, it is possible to compare China and Europe in a controlled way that avoids the silliness at times associated with arguments as to whether some idea was pre-scientific or proto-scientific or perhaps modern, or then again not. Saying this does not imply any unconditional adherence to Crombie's ideas. Note: there is a lucid and careful critique in Iliff, 1998. End of note. It is drawing attention to a method that offers a fruitful way of disaggregating a question into more manageable sub-questions, namely how far pre-modern Chinese thinkers had developed the various styles of thinking that have in the long run, as they have combined with each other, proved crucial to the growth of a distinctively modern science. This combination might even be used as the basis of a secure definition of the development of increasing degrees of such modernity. As I have shown, note Elvin, 1993-4, as of about 1600, China possessed in varying degrees all of the styles of thought identified by Crombie as the eventual key components of science: the postulational, like Euclidean geometry, the experimental, hypothetical modelling, taxonomy, the probabilistic and historical derivation, the prototype of which in Europe was the study of the genesis and diversification of the Indo-European languages, with the apparent exception of the probabilistic, which hardly yet existed at this time even in Europe. By this date these styles were mostly less strongly formulated in China than in Europe, but they were there. The revolution in Europe after 1600, insofar as there was one, lay mainly in the acceleration with which these styles of thought both developed and interconnected, rather than in any fundamental qualitative innovation, probability accepted. By 1750, China was far behind in almost every one of these domains, the historical being perhaps the only doubtful case, if we recall a sustained scholarly program, in a more or less Lacatosian sense, to reconstruct the filiation of ancient Chinese pronunciations of characters as these pronunciations changed over time. Another way of looking at the issue of continuity versus radical change in 17th century European scientific thinking is to reread Newton's Principia, adopting the imagined mindset of a scholar of any nationality, sufficiently steeped in the Chinese tradition to be able to look at Europe, even if only momentarily, with the eyes of a cultural outsider. I tried this seemingly, but only seemingly, disingenuous thought experiment recently with Bernard Cohen, and Anne Whitman's lucid new translation. Note, Newton, translation 1999. End of note. It is a totally unrigorous procedure, but the result makes a sort of sense. Such a person's first reaction would almost certainly be that this is a book conceptually deeply rooted in European antiquity, as with its diagrams that seem so Euclidean at first sight, and its pervasive use of ratios, combined perhaps with some later medieval notions like that of acceleration, invented some time before 1235 in Merton College. Note, Crombie, 1994, Volume 1, pages 412 to 414. His second reaction would be one of awe, as the wizardry with which the lines of these diagrams take on imaginary motions in the mind, approaching their own extinction, and conjuring up limits and the concepts of the calculus. Seen in the imagination from the other end of Eurasia, it is both traditionally and recognizably European, and breathtakingly new. An old and needless conflict thus to some extent dissolves. The capacity to translate ourselves at will to a different conceptual perspective on our own local history by means of an imaginative absorption into that of China is one of Needham's most fruitful and underappreciated gifts to the field. These are impressionistic remarks, as befits an introduction and perhaps only permissible in such a context. What I hope they suggest is that there are still argument-sharpening comparisons and perspectives accessible to Western historians of Western science if they will familiarize themselves in a serious and sophisticated way with the world of pre-modern Chinese science opened up by Needham and his collaborators. The adjectives serious and sophisticated matter. Credit must be given to scholars who have recently attempted a comparative analysis, such as David Goodman and Colin Russell in the Open University textbook The Rise of Scientific Europe, 1500 to 1800, which is in many ways admirably multiple-angled in its approach, and Toby Huff, The Rise of Early Modern Science, Islam, China and the West, which raises the majority of the key issues, even if it does not always probe deeply enough. Note, Goodman and Russell 1991 and Huff 1993. End of note. Apart from a number of avoidable factual errors, they suffer, however, from two systemic defects. Note, one example will serve. Goodman and Russell, 1991, page 7, state that the Chinese Empire had reached its furthest extension in the 6th century AD. It was at this time that the Muslim Empire, expanding northeast from Persia, encountered the Chinese and defeated them. It was, of course, not the 6th century, but the late 7th and the 8th centuries. The key battle at the Talus River was in 751. See Blunden and Elvin, 1983, pages 92 to 3. In the 6th century, Islam did not even exist, and the Chinese Empire recrystallized only after the 580s, with the Sui dynasty. End of note. The first of these is an inability to use the prism of chronology to split the light from the Chinese past into periods with distinct characteristics. Thus, Huff states that the Chinese state in theory owned all the land and mineral wealth of the country, so that even mining operations were operated as government monopolies. Likewise, all banking innovations, such as letters of credit, long-distance facilitation of exchange, and so forth, were taken over as state monopolies. There was no scope for entrepreneurial innovation, and thus disinterested learning was discouraged, because these avenues of advancement were closed without state sponsorship. Note, Huff, 1993, pages 312 to 13. It is worth repeating that, like the other works criticized above, this book has merits that justify the provision of the sinological qualification and correction that follows. Leaving aside the issue of theoretical eminent state domain, which was important up to and during the first millennium, but rarely later, the point in the first two sentences apply to some sectors at some periods and in some places, but virtually never universally. There was plenty of private mining from Sung through to Qing times. Note, Golas, 1999, end of note. And private instruments of credit were extensively used during the Song, as they were under the Qing, which also saw the rise of private financial institutions like the money shops. Under the Qing, the long-distance transfer of funds was handled above all by the Shanxi banks, which were technically private, though in a sort of symbiotic relationship with the government. The last sentence in the quoted passage is, however, untrue. The Chinese economy during most of the last millennium fizzed with entrepreneurial activity. This is apparent from, for example, Shiba Yoshinobu's Commerce and Society in Song China, and the material cited in my own books, The Pattern of the Chinese Past and Another History, 1996. Note, Elvin, 1973, and 1996. But there is plenty of other evidence, both primary and secondary. Given this, which is a fact that cannot reasonably be disputed by anyone who is informed, the logic of Huff's becomes the crux of the issue. If it is a valid statement of a historical causal relationship, then there must have been abundant disinterested learning in China during the Middle and later empires. If there was not, then it is false. His and the reader's choice. It should be noted here that the pioneering nature of Needham's work meant that he himself, half a century ago, could not develop a fully integrated chronological approach to the development and the setbacks of Chinese science and technology in their full historical social contexts. Practical reasons obliged him and his collaborators to begin by treating the subject topic by topic, and so to create an encyclopedia in the best sense of that word, often profound and provocative, but compartmentalized. It also seems likely that he was personally uncomfortable with the prospect of exploring a logic of Chinese historical development that might prove too different from the immobile and Eurocentric formulae of the Soviet and Chinese Marxism of his time, though Marx himself, one suspects, with his independence of mind, might well have relished the task, given adequate information to work with. Note, Joan Robertson, 1942, in an essay on Marxian economics, long ago pointed out how extensively Marx changed his ideas from those in Volume 1 of Das Kapital to those embodied in the fragments published as Volume 3, ending up by seeing underconsumption as the most likely cause of crises in capitalist economies. End of note. As I have already noted, Needham acknowledged, but at the same time evaded the issue by comprehensively defining the imperial Chinese system over 2 millennia as bureaucratic feudalism, a new term in this context, and one which is discussed at several points in the present volume. The problem with this label, as I suggested to him in private correspondence and discussion in the early 1960s, is not only that any tightly constrained and testable definition that one constructs for this concept is unlikely to work equally well for all periods, but that its adoption tends to negate a priori the possibility of recognizing significant changes. Note, Needham Papers in the Needham Research Institute. End of note. The once justifiable excuse of the constraint of insufficient information has, moreover, ceased to apply for some time now, and one of the long-term objectives of present and future historians of Chinese science has to be precisely to restructure the mass of information made available by Needham and by his collaborators and his successors and critics, by no means disjoint sets of persons, into a synthesis more sensitive to the long-term changes in Chinese society and culture. The second defect in the two comparative studies just mentioned is a disinclination both to analyze the meanings of key terms and to show how they might fit into an explicit argument focused on the development or non-development of scientific thinking in various socio-intellectual contexts. Here we can take as an example the idea of proof. Huff sees as foremost among the main defects of Chinese mathematical and scientific thought that it lacked the logic of proof as well as the concept of mathematical proof. Note, Huff, 1993, page 288, See also page 278. End of note. Goodman, in Goodman and Russell 1991, concurs. A shortcoming of Chinese science is the absence of the idea of proof, so important in Western science since the time of the ancient Greeks. Note, Goodman and Russell 1991, page 12. End of note. The issue here is not the absence or presence in pre-modern Chinese mathematics of the ideal of proof in the sense of a consistent system of primitive terms, a set of axioms, and more or less fully formalized rules for generating well-formed propositions and true theorems as exemplified in a Western tradition running from before Euclid down to Hilbert. Apart from the flickers of almost Boolean logic in the Mohist canon 2,000 years before Boole, it is generally agreed that this is a fair statement of the case. Note: for a summary of the debate between the present author and Professor Makem on this, see Elvin 1996, pages 276-9, also Elvin 1990. End of note. The issues are rather the following. 1. In 4 out of the 6 of Crombie's styles of scientific thinking, proof in this sharply defined sense is not relevant to scientific advance in what we might loosely call an early modern level. This comment applies to modelling, experimentation, taxonomy, and historical derivation, though not of course to the postulational style, nor, with some reservations, to probabilistic thinking. With respect to particular fields, it clearly plays little or no part in chemistry, the earth sciences, or the life sciences at this level. The case can also be made that it is of little importance even for the early history of some parts of physics, such as magnetism. If it was so crucial an element, one would have expected to see marked differences in China between the domains where the absence of proof mattered and where it did not. So far as I can tell, if we examine the period 1550 to 1750, this was not the case, or only weakly so. 2. If we take as a rough working rule, to simplify a subtle discussion, the notion that theorems are discovered but proofs are invented, in what specific crucial aspects as regards discovery did what we may term Euclidean Hilbertian proof in Western mathematics differ from what I would describe as the sequences of coordinated demonstrations that we find in the best traditional Chinese mathematics? Works like the Chu Chang Xuan Shu, 9 chapters on mathematical procedures, which in its 3rd century commentaries by Liu Hui at least come close at times to what Karin Kemmler has called algebraic proof within an algorithmic context. Note, Kemmler 1997-8. End of note. They are not just numerical cookery books. Even if we do not yet easily go all the way with Kemmler's challenging formulation, there is a need for an examination of the particularities in this domain, rather than the unexamined generalities. Moreover, Song and Yuan mathematics was still capable of important discoveries, such as aspects of modular algebra and the theory of determinants. Note: see the revised edition of Blunden and Elvin 1998 Principles of Mathematics, pages 194 to 197, for a sketch of these and other topics. The original English language edition of 1983 contains misprint in this section. See also Science and Civilisation in China, Volume 3. End of note. The late imperial discovery barrier problem remains as elusive as it is important. 3. Though it was certainly not non-existent, it seems likely that the drive to what might be called the mathematization of observations was significantly weaker in pre-modern China than in Greek antiquity, or in Europe after the later Middle Ages. The Chinese artisans who built rectangular trough, pallet chain pumps for drainage and irrigation in the lower Yangtze region in late imperial times altered the proportions of troughs and pallets by, one assumes, trial and error to optimize the use of energy for different angles of inclination of the trough, presumably knowing but keeping to themselves the appropriate empirical proportions. The 18th century French hydraulic engineer, de Bailidor, using simple Euclidean geometry plus simple mechanics, calculated and published the specific optimal ratios for the same type of pump, which was clearly, by a nice twist, originally borrowed from China. Note: discussed and documented in Elvin 1975, reprinted in Elvin 1986, pages 98 to 99. The French name was Ulan à chapelet, or pompe à chapelet, in other words, a rosary beads pump. End of note. Although proof hovers in the background because of the geometry, the crucial difference here was the early modern European desire not only to express the particular proportions observed in both cultures to work better or worse according to the slope in numbers, but above all to find a general way of calculating the best for any given circumstances. The mathematization of observations is not the same as the use of proofs. Though the distinction can be subtle, it needs to be made.